actually building in time in your practice or building in time in your development where they are intentionally put in very adverse situations mentally and physically and being straightforward with it from the beginning. The other piece that I think we do well is actually mentally preparing players by having them visualize moments that may occur.
Welcome to the Cutting Edge Coaching Podcast, where we believe coaches are some of the most important teachers and leaders in the world, and they deserve to be supported. I'm your host, Luke Gromer, and every week we're bringing you conversations with coaches, experts, and leaders from across sports that will give you practical ideas and strategies that you can apply in your coaching to develop high-performing teams and high-character people. Coaches, I'm excited to welcome Chad Songy to the podcast. Chad is head of curriculum at PGC Basketball, a course director for PGC, and assists in PGC's training of both directors and staff. Chad is also the founder of Sustainable Giving Homes, which uses real estate profits from homes in Austin, Texas, and Cape Town, South Africa, to fund educational opportunities for students throughout Africa, including PGC's sponsorship of the MCF Sports Center in Kenya. He also teaches throughout the year through a variety of projects he founded that include stand-up comedy, cultural growth experiences in Africa, and mentoring young leaders and entrepreneurs. In this conversation, we talk about some of the survey results from a study Chad is conducting, where he's asking college basketball coaches what tangible and intangible skills they wish incoming freshmen already possessed in order to make a greater impact on their teams, shaping peer-to-peer interactions, and a simple framework to increase learning and retention with your athletes. As always, if you enjoyed the episode and want to grab a free copy of the podcast notes, just go to cuttingedgecoach.com/podcast or click the link in the show details to download a free PDF of notes from this episode or any episode of the podcast. And if you'd like to learn more about what we offer coaches, just go to cuttingedgecoach.com or check out the links in the show details. Now to my conversation with Chad. Enjoy the episode. Coach is really excited to welcome Chad Songy to the podcast today. Chad, before I ask you our first question, why don't you just quickly share with the audience everything that you kind of have your hands in the coaching and basketball world?
Oh man, well it's changed a lot over the last 12 years, but currently I am leading PGC basketball's curriculum. I am in charge of all of our director training, so I teach all of our teachers. And then I have, it's probably also fair to say, head of curriculum, but also a co-founder in Strata Athletics, where we're trying to eventually take data and analytics from pro sports, particularly basketball at the current time, and apply it to measuring life skills and all the intangibles like leadership and communication and resiliency and eye contact and all these things. So yeah, doing several different things and also leading our pro and college session for PGC. So 10 male and female pros, 10 pros of each gender and 20 Division I athletes of each gender. So got my hands in quite a little bit of things. It makes every day interesting and very diverse. But grateful to still be in hoops and hopefully making an impact in a lot of lives.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, the thing we're going to start off talking about, I'm really excited to learn about. We exchanged some communication a few months ago, and you said, hey, actually, can we put the podcast on hold because I'm doing this really cool survey of college coaches? And I'm just going to read the question you said you sent to these college coaches and then want to hear what you found out from them. So you asked hundreds of college basketball coaches this question: what skills, both tangible and intangible, do you wish incoming freshmen would already possess in order to have a more fulfilling experience / freshman year, make a greater contribution to the program immediately, and make your job as a coach easier? I love this question, and I'm really, really curious to hear what these coaches had to say, because I think hopefully there's some practical things and some things that for us as coaches, regardless of level, we should be able to take and be like, okay, I need to place a greater emphasis on these things. So tell us about this survey and what you found.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I'm still in the midst of it. To be fair, all many friends and many friends of friends in college basketball, they are pedaling as fast as they can with all the transfer portal changes, and NIL has thrown some real interesting challenges their way. So I'm waiting to probably hear back from my ultimate goal is in the next year. Can I have over 100 male college coaches perspectives, over 100 female college coach perspectives, and 50 pro coaches. But I've heard back for many, and I did a first kind of consolidation of the data. Um, I wouldn't say there's a definitive one that's above the others, but first I would say that the data back has given me one great insight as to what we should be preparing our pro and college players for at this college and pro session. But also gave me a lot of confidence in what we've taught at PGC for 15, or I've taught at PGC for 15 years, but PGC has taught for 30 years. So I would say the intangible that I've seen the most, I haven't actually, I can't give you the percentages just yet, and I want to wait till I'm kind of complete. But as I consolidate some of the data on Saturday, mental resilience would definitely be one. I think, and I would call that responding to adversity. I would, it's been phrased several different ways, but I think resiliency. So being able to get through adversity and challenges, and just being mentally resilient. Some people might call it grit, you know, but I think that would be one. I think communication is one that I have seen a lot. Surprisingly, leadership has not been mentioned, but it might be because of it's an incoming player and it's not an expectation for coaches. Interestingly enough, but I would say mental resilience would definitely top, and communication would be second, and then dependability has actually come up quite a bit, which was interesting. So, sometimes expressed in the form of like time management, or just being able to be where you say you're going to be and not have to be checked in on. So I think that was interesting on the intangible side. And then the two tangible that I would say have come up easily the most often would be shooting, which is pretty, obvious. And then the other would be really decision making. So, and this is interesting because it made me feel confident in probably about 80% of the court time at our pro and college session I'm going to spend on either shooting or putting players in advantage read situations where they're then reading a tag defender or learning how to read the helper's help and reading that rotation and then working on passing accuracy out of that rotation. So very few players actually work on passing accuracy, and then very few work on it out of making a decision. And how much does my pass then impact? And we'll talk about creating, maintaining, and elongating a half-second advantage, because really all the game you're doing at the high levels is there's a lot of different ways to create that half-second advantage, whether that's off the bounce or ball handoff or ball screen or all those dribble handoff. There's all sorts of strategies and tactics, but you're basically trying to create a half-second advantage, and the best teams are good at maintaining that advantage, right, as the defense is rotating. So it's been really cool to see, and this was one of my hypotheses as well, is that I think players have gotten so skilled and are uber athletic and can beat players one-on-one so well, and they're spending so much more time in training versus probably pickup or sometimes in games, that I think being able to read rotation on defense and read closeouts and read the help side defense is actually lacking. And so that was kind of cool to see thus far those kind of trends, as that's what I'm planning to cover in the curriculum. And then also the court sessions, the classroom sessions for these college and pro players. I actually fortunate enough to bring in an NBA psychologist who works with NBA and WNBA teams, and he's going to do his mental resiliency module, which is just perfect for the feedback we've been getting, and also some high consequence performance stuff. Mano Watts, our president at PGC, is going to come in and do the belief work that he did with Jeremy Lin, which is very similar to, I worked with Daniel Alexander, who was formerly with the Spurs G League team and actually scored the highest, I think, ever in the Spurs organization for their 3-point shooting as they measure players. And he blew out his knee, was having an exceptional year in Europe and looking like he was going to get a shot at the league, and then blew out his knee. And so I went on a deep kind of mental journey that I feel like Dina Evans kind of brought me through, and did that with him for 3 months before he was about to go overseas, before COVID kind of changed that. So Mano and I are going to do some deep kind of confidence belief stuff. And so I think a lot of the classroom stuff is actually going to be in line with what a lot of these coaches have said. But one also interesting tidbit is coaches don't know the difference, I think, between tangible and intangible, because I got many answers and I'm like, that's two intangible things, or that's two tangible things. But it's been really interesting to see, what I think I might have to, in future research, define the vocabulary a little bit more in detail, because I've been really, I've just giggled. I've had to laugh, man. It's been really awesome though, and really grateful for to give them a hard time, I should be more conscious of all the time and energy that so many have given to me. So yeah, so really interesting to see, and I had a really kind friend who's a Division 1 coach who's been at Power Fives and Ivy Leagues and all over, and he connected me the other Monday. I woke up and he had individually texted 52 coaches with me with that question, and it was just huge for getting so many diverse perspectives from around the country. So it's been really fascinating to see so many perspectives.
Yeah, that's awesome. Really interesting to hear about those responses. And you mentioned it, and I've worked with PGC basketball for a few summers, exposed to what you guys do, and you mentioned it that it's as on those intangible qualities, things that you guys have already been teaching athletes. And I'd love for you to talk about mental resiliency a little bit more, responding to adversity first, and some of the things that you guys do at PGC or that you have found to be effective in your coaching through PGC or Strata or other avenues. Like how does that actually take life for you and your coaching? Because again, like you said, these college coaches recognize it. I think most of us as coaches recognize that the way that athletes respond to adversity matters a lot to their success, the team success, to your culture. So how have you actually been able to implement things in your coaching that are helping athletes build those muscles of mental resilience?
Yeah, great question. I think a couple of ways. I think at PGC we do a really good job of actually putting them in adverse situations that are very unfair and acknowledging at times that they're unfair or acknowledging that they're harder than a real game, and then coaching through that, coaching intangible moments. And some of that is art, right? It's just noticing the moment and then highlighting it or highlighting a behavior we want to see when a player responds really well to a mistake or to adversity. So I think that's one piece is actually building in time in your practice or building in time in your development where they are intentionally put in very adverse situations mentally and physically and being straightforward with it from the beginning. The other piece that I think we do well is actually mentally preparing players by having them visualize moments that may occur. So one of the things I'll do at on the fourth day of my session is like, hey, if you play, and most players have aspirations to play in college, play professionally, that come to PGC, if you play into those spaces, you are going to be injured. It would be shocking to go through an entire high school and college career and never have a pretty, a big injury. Maybe not a season-ending injury, but like something that you at least sit out for multiple weeks. And so what I have them do is actually do an exercise where they visualize getting into their season, having a lot of success, and then having a season-ending injury and mentally go through how are they going to respond to that moment. So fascinating, and I'll share. He Dane Weisenbach has actually started to do a little content creation assistance at PGC, but he has his own content creation thing. Here's a kid who comes to my session, does that, then he's in a senior year, would have a football or basketball scholarship, blows out his ACL, MCL in football his senior year, right? And so you're done. Decides, hey, I'm gonna pick up video work. Never done it. Gonna pick up video work and then like makes this amazing, video stuff. And his high school basketball team ends up winning state championship. He has this amazing thing, and then gets hired by like the Utah State football team to do their social media. And then I was like, hey, this guy's amazing. We need to have him at PGC. And so I'll share, and maybe you can put it in the show notes for your. We did a little ESPN like game day 5-minute story about him. But I think it's just one example of like when you prepare someone mentally for something that could potentially happen, when they get to that moment, they've already actually mentally thought about it. And the other piece, which is a little, but I think highly effective, is who are you going to be? So actually changing the athlete's identity rather than just like predicting of like, oh, I might respond this way, is like deciding the identity of the person you're going to be when that adversity hits. And so that's way more powerful, I find. It's like, all right, imagine you're going into your freshman year and you don't play at all. Who are you going to be in that moment? And how are you going to bring value to you? And then visualize that whole experience. So I think I heard someone else talk about, visualization. We visualize our best plays all the time. but actually spending 20% of your time visualizing poor moments or visualizing you lose a game and how do you actually respond. So like visualizing both the positive and the negative. And then also I think like deciding who you're going to show up as in a future moment when adversity hits, and then trying to walk athletes through as many examples of that adversity as possible. So then even if it's not the exact scenario and some other adversity hits, they at least have a tie back to who they were going to be when things didn't go their way.
I love that. I think that's so good, so practical too. And this has come up in a lot of conversations I've had. It's just the power and importance of having your team, your athletes consider things beforehand, things that you know are likely to happen. And like you said too, I think you made an important point. Often we just think about, what are we going to do when, or visualize these things that go well, but what about when things go poorly? And when there's heartbreak or there's struggle, and then like you said too, who do we want to be there? I think that's also, like you said, an important shift in language that, yeah, behavior flows from our identity. And so actually having it framed in that way, and then hopefully as a coach, knowing that, having that conversation with the athlete where they share that or express it, or they write it down and you read it. And then to be able to say, hey, Chad, this is who you said you wanted to be when this happens. Are you being that now? How can I help you be that? Right. That's so powerful.
100%. 100%. And even, Dane mentions it in this video he's created about his story of when it happened. I didn't say, "Hey, I'm excited you tore your ACL," but I remember being like, "Dane, I'm actually really excited to see how you respond because I think your response is going to be pretty inspirational." And because we had already had all this, context to it, that comment has so much more power and relevance than if you just were like, "Hey, I'm trying to keep your head up." It's the difference from like, "Oh, I'm just trying to look on the bright side." It's like, "Hey, actually, you're prepared for this moment, and I'm really excited to see how you lead or inspire other people." And that, meant a lot to him and helped him on his journey towards what is his trajectory going to be. So I think it just gives us, or even just saying, "Hey, you prepared for this." Like, or hey, we as a team, we prepared for this adversity. I love when coaches mention at halftime, "Hey, we're up, but basketball's a game of runs." They are going to make a run in the second half, and we need to be ready for it and be calm and then respond. It's like, of course, like prepare your team for what is going to come. And then when you get in that scenario, it's like, "Hey, timeout. Hey, they got 8 straight points. We were ready for this. We knew it was going to come. Let's go out and get a great, shot on this next offensive possession." Like that's the type of proactive coaching and kind of premeditated coaching that I think has really huge impacts for athletes being able to be better versions of themselves when things aren't going their way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point there. And yeah, yeah, so good. I like you said, the ability of a coach to frame it that way too, and just to be grounded in kind of reality. This is the reality of our sport. This is the reality of what often happens, and it's okay. Normalize it, right? Okay, this is normal. It happens. Now, what can we control and go do from here? I think that's really good. The next thing I want to talk about, and I think it kind of connects back with one of those responses you got on the intangibles from coaches in communication, and that's something that they really want players to come in and be better at, and they see how important it is. And one of the other things I wanted to talk with you about, and I think it may connect to it, is as coaches, when we're trying to shape our culture, lead our team, develop our athletes, one of the things I don't think we spend enough time considering, and I know I'm guilty of this, is shaping the peer-to-peer interactions of the athletes on our team. And, a big piece of that is obviously communication. I think there's other things there too, but I would love to just hear your thoughts and kind of philosophy behind that is how do we shape peer-to-peer interactions that we don't have total control over? We can influence some, but we don't have control over how Chad responds to whoever else is on our team, right? So how
Yeah.
do we actually shape that and influence it in that positive direction that we want it moving to build our culture up and to build the athletes up?
Yeah, great question. I think there's like on court communication, which I think we do a great job teaching, and I think a lot, and now more and more coaches are spending time on. But you're talking about like what's all this off the court really, or dead ball time communication? We talk about a lot of live ball time communication, right? I think as teachers and coaches. Um, I will say a caveat, like how I would answer this to a college coach from a college team perspective. When I go in and work with teams, let's say as a consultant, I would approach that differently from a college perspective as to a high school and even below high school level. However, at the high school and below high school level, I think having a grace and understanding that, especially in the seventh and eighth grade range, but even throughout high school, there's a lot of social emotional development happening where they care very much what their peers think. And I would argue like we always still care what our peers think. Adults still also want to be cool. We just don't call it cool. Like everyone wants to be accepted. And so I think we forget how, like I try to go back to seventh grade Chad as best I can, of how self-conscious I was, how much I was trying to become a man, and like there's all these pressures, right? And so I think we have to be really graceful when we consider how we ask athletes to show up, that we can both honor where they are in their journey and then also try to influence behavior. So one of the things that I'll often do is, I'm not going to go 100% right away. I'm going to build trust with players, right? Before I potentially challenge or ask them how they interact with each other. There are certain, non-negotiables. Like if someone's being a terrible teammate, I'm never going to allow that and other things. But as far as leadership and communication goes, I'm going to take little baby steps as I build more and more trust throughout the season with a player, let's say. And then the other thing is I will take away the cool kid power in a sense. So I can go into a group like this past year. I went into this high school program, boys and girls, and maybe it's because of my experiences. Maybe I'm gifted in social emotional stuff. Maybe, but I can walk into a gym and watch high school teams just shooting around, and I can tell who the popular kids are within about 90 seconds because of how what players where they bring their eyes after moments. You can tell who am I going to see, did they determine if that was cool or if that was funny or whatever. Like you just watch eye contact, and I went into Wyoming, and the coaches were shocked, and I was like, those are the two most influential girls, and that's the most influential guy, and they were like, what the hell, you've been in here 60 seconds, right? And so for those kids, I am going to actually not put them in such leadership situations where like they are the captain, they are the culture, but I'm going to very cleverly have them contribute, participate, answer questions, give them small leadership tasks to where then they can I'm not going to pick the goody two shoes to actually lead right away. Because if that what often happens is you pick the player who's, the best leader or the goody two shoes. Now if your best player is also your best leader, that's a gift and that kind of changes some of the dynamics. But most of the time, the best initial leaders or communicators or people who are doing the most things intangibly are the players who suck or aren't as good. Right? And so if you use those players and be like, everyone, this is the model, this is whatever. Well, all the good players and everyone else is like, yeah, but he sucks, right? Or she sucks. And so I'm not going to follow that. So what I do is I actually try to get who are potentially the best players or potentially the most influential people. And if I can actually shape them, and Doc Rivers says I battle for my culture every day. When I go into a PGC session and I've got 120 athletes from all over the country, I figure it out very quickly, and I'm like, all right, I'm almost going to mold these players into my best leaders in the first 2 days, and then it takes everyone else's excuse not to. The coolest kid is already doing it. They can't make fun of it because they're doing it, right? So instead of laughing in the back at the goody two shoes, like they're the one that's being challenged by the coach to do it. So then a lot of times they kind of like rise to the occasion. And then I actually am influencing a lot of peer to peer stuff that way. Because the person who would be making fun of someone or would be rolling their eyes or whatever is actually now on board. And then it's way easier to have the rest of the group on board. And then, I can't control every peer to peer interaction, but then I can then start across the board highlighting behavior I want to see of saying like, I know I'll obviously highlight, the cool kid doing this well, and then also this kid who was, the goody two shoes from the beginning, I can highlight them, and so then it kind of snowballs. So that's been my approach, and I'm not perfect at it, and every human is different, so every group dynamic is different, but it's been really interesting, and I think I am probably a little quicker than most at getting a group of people towards a destination because of how I kind of try to manipulate some of those group dynamics.
That's really good. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that of making sure that you build trust and you influence that influencer, essentially, as the coach. And like you said, that will go a long way towards shaping those peer-to-peer interactions and how they interact together. Because like you said at the beginning, which I think is so important to highlight and remember, just considering, what was I like at this age? And, as maybe, um, yeah, most of us may not want to go back and relive that, but if we're honest, it'll probably give us some deep insight into how we should be coaching and leading the young people in front of us. It's so important to actually ask that question. Joe Ehrman shared a quote with me when I talked to him. He just said, "The principle is that you need to be the coach you needed at that age, only be that coach now." And I think that's
Mm,
so powerful. And
yeah,
and like you said, to recognize that and then influence those influencers because yeah, there's those one or two big influencers, and then at most ages, junior high, high school level, they're just gonna kind of flow with what that person does,
yeah.
especially at the beginning. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you shared there.
And I would just add, they want our attention, and so really trying to highlight the behavior I want to see, and sometimes waiting for 2 or 3 minutes, and I'm like, will someone just blank, right? And then when I see it, being like, hey, I see you, I see you, Sam, great job on blank, right? Whatever it is. And I think that's an important piece too, that we often will point out, hey, we aren't doing blank, we aren't hustling, or hey, out here no one communicator, hey, they just made a mistake, no one picked them up. And that actually I don't think influences behavior as much as waiting to for someone to do it even half well and then acknowledging it, right? I think at the end of the day they want coaches' attention and they want to be highlighted in front of the group.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Catch 'em being good, it's so powerful, and we don't do it enough. We just default to identifying everything that's going wrong, and it's way more powerful to catch them doing it right.
Yeah.
Well, we've got a few minutes left, Chad, and this is a big topic, but I know you've got some nuggets here, so I'll challenge you to just share a few pieces of wisdom on another topic that I know you're passionate about: retention and learning. What should we as coaches be thinking about when it comes to those two topics?
Oh, yeah, that's probably a whole podcast. But I was fortunate enough to be exposed to some teachers who were working as consultants in professional sports. So and I'm sure you're probably familiar with Doug Lemov and Mark Manella, where and basically they're helping professional coaches become better teachers. And so Mark actually exposed me to Make It Stick, a wonderful book that has a ton of research around learning and retention. And I would highly recommend coaches read that, as I think all learning, even if it's whether it's physical or mental, it's the brain stores things in the similar way. And so in that, I mean, one of the I guess nuggets to share with your listeners is the STIC method. So STIC, and so S being spacing, so actually spacing out your learning, and then the T being testing. And actually, one of the best ways to retain information is to actually just test yourself. So, like crazy enough, the old adage of just like flashcards, but actually spacing that testing. So there was a really interesting study where they had people who had never learn Spanish, and they split up into two groups. Right, they'd never heard a Spanish word before, and one group got 8 hours of learning, and the other group got the exact same 8 hours learning, but 4 hours, and then another month 4 hours. And then they waited like I don't know, it was some long period, like 2 years or 3 years, and then tested them again. And the group that just had learned the exact same stuff but spaced out over 2 periods had like 200 something percent more retention long term. And so the biggest thing around all this retention and learning, it's often opposite of what you feel. And that's actually the hardest part to convince learners sometimes of when you cram for something, you feel like you learned it more. And you will be prepared in the short term, probably higher. You'll do well in the test. But as far as when you're thinking about long term retention, the more you can actually, your brain has to struggle to retain something or pull something back of the memory, and we don't know why yet. Hopefully science will figure it out. But for some reason, when you struggle more to remember something, your brain actually stores it higher in a long-term retention way. So that's the importance of spacing learning out. So I think that's one really important concept to think about as we're thinking about practice planning, and we're thinking about learning, and in the classroom, we often will scaffold back to concepts. And in basketball, sometimes we do it intentionally, sometimes we do it accidentally. But thinking about your spacing. So spacing testing, the I is interleaving. So that the easiest way to think about that is basically if I were to do math problems, if I do, oh, and I got a low battery, so hopefully this recording, I hope you'll excuse me, but so if I were to do 20 math problems and I were to do 5 addition, 5 subtraction, 5 multiplication, 5 division, I would actually feel like I learned it better that way, and that's how we normally teach in school. Is we chunk things together, and we'll do 5 additions and 5 subtractions. But crazy enough, if I actually interleave the learning, so I did 1 addition, 1 subtraction, 1 multiplication, 1 division, and then did that 5 times, I'm going to do worse in the short term during those 20 problems, but my long-term retention of that information is light years higher. So that's the hard part too, is convincing the learner of like, hey, I know it feels like you're picking it up slower, but your long-term retention of this, and they've tested this with physical motor skills as well. It's not just like memory things. And then the last is categorizing. So that's like creating information trees or categorizing things in groups. So rather than teaching you everything I could about basketball, if I categorize it to offense and defense, and then offensive transition and offensive, if I taught you in what I call information trees, right, where it's like kind of breaks down and a branch and then leaves, your brain, for some reason, when you categorize things like that, is able to retain more information. So there's tons more information to make it stick and tons of other ideas, but I think thinking about how are we also just, and this is what I've done a lot of with the director training, is just like random testing, and it's not from an evaluation perspective, not using testing to see like how are you doing evaluative, but just to say, hey, we are only testing you so that you will learn and remember this information even further. And that's the thing that I think people don't respect about, like, let's say LeBron. LeBron is a freakish athlete, but the way your long-term memory and your working memory work together is the more you can store in your long-term memory, the more processing space is freed in your working memory. So if I ask you, like, what color is a polar bear? Well, you immediately know white, right? Because that's stored in your long-term memory. So you don't have to use any processing speed for that. And so the more basketball knowledge we can put into athletes' long-term memories around, these are the rotations of a zone when the ball is here and you have an advantage here, or when there's a screen and roll, like this is where the tags fit. The more chunking we can do of those patterns and put those patterns into their long-term memory, like, chess players do, the more in those moments, their working memory is then free to process the actual spacing or the movement of individuals and where they are. And so I think it's really important as coaches to think about, how can we increase the overall retention of basketball information, and rather than just teach them plays, teach them how the game works, and then let them use their working memory to try to process in the moment and make decisions.
That's so good. Make it stick. Gonna pick that one up for sure, and love that acronym. Chad, this has been fantastic. Before we wrap it up and hop off, just share with listeners where they can connect with you.
Sure, probably Instagram is kind of just more my personal life, but I connect on Twitter. I have to be honest, I am not the most prolific sharer, as I tend to just connect individually with people. And truthfully, I respect all the sharers, but I think that also creates then something you have to maintain or feel like you have to maintain. So, but people can find me on Twitter, Chad Songy, my name on Twitter. I often will reshare great stuff from basketball minds and people that I enjoy, but just to set fair expectations, I'm not out here creating content every week.
That's great. Well, Chad, thanks again for your time and for sharing some great stuff with the listeners.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Luke. Have a great one.
Coaches, thanks for listening to this episode, and thanks to Chad for joining me. As always, if you enjoyed this episode and want a copy of the free podcast notes, go to cuttingedgecoach.com/podcast or click the link in the show details to download a free PDF of notes from this episode or any episode of the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, would you take a minute to either share a takeaway with us on Twitter or share it with a coaching friend. Those things go a long way in helping us share with more coaches who can then impact more athletes. Thanks for listening to the podcast.